All right, welcome everybody to this FuelEU Maritime countdown for optimizing bunker procurement panel discussion. My name is Risto-Kariranta and I'm CEO of Ahti Climate Company, focusing on shipping, emission, compliance, cost optimization, and through that also very much focused on this FuelEU Maritime regulation. Together with me, we have here today James Helliwell from V.Ships, Samir Fernandez from CEPSA, or do you say it somehow some other way? Probably you will can explain by yourself, and then Daejin from FertiStream. And let's start by proper introductions. So could you, James, start and tell a little bit about yourself, where you are now and why you are here?
Yeah, thanks, Risto. Great to be here. Hi, everyone. My name's James Helliwell. I'm the Decarbonisation Manager for V.Group. At V.Group, we're one of the world's largest ship managers, with about 44,000 seafarers operating on vessels around the world. And last year we had about 180 or so vessels that were trading in the European Union. So this FuelEU Maritime regulation is quite important and quite impactful for the ships that we operate. My role as Decarbonisation Manager is leading all our work to comply with FuelEU Maritime. Really looking forward to be part of the session today.
All right, thank you, James. Samir, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you're joining from. Yeah, my name is Samir Fernandez, and I am the Director of Marine Fuels for CEPSA. CEPSA is a Spanish oil major. We basically are the largest supplier of marine fuels in the Straits of Gibraltar, or the Bay of Algeciras, whichever one you want to call it. We do about 4 million tons of conventional fuel as of now, and have made huge inroads into the supply of biofuels, as well as part of CEPSA's positive motion strategy. We're already getting ready for the next generation of e-fuels with the launch of the largest green hydrogen valley project in the south of Spain. So looking forward to the discussion and offering solutions on what we can do to help customers on the path to decarbonisation.
Very good. Thank you, Samir. And Daejin, would you like to introduce, say a couple of words about yourself?
Thank you for pronouncing my name very correctly. So hello, this is Daejin Lee. Basically, I'm based in Dubai. FertiStream is based on Dubai company as a fertilizer trader, and also we are also providing freight as well. So I'm heading freight research group as well as commodity research in FertiStream, and then also responsible for decarbonization in our company. So basically, we are looking at many regulations because we have a branch in Europe as well as Singapore and Brazil and many areas, and then we found out it's very difficult to understand all those regulations. But obviously, we will discuss today, and then we hopefully share the view that what is difficulty, what is the availability, as well as what is the pain point for all of us. And then I will provide a more charterer's point of view, as well as maybe some point of operator's point of view. Thank you.
Very good. A little bit about the practicalities today. So you have the possibility to write your own questions to the chat, and we try to answer as many as possible during this session. We have our own prepared questions, of course, that we will go through, and finally we have joint polls so that we can ask also your opinion about certain questions. And as a starters, we would actually want to start with one of the polls, and the first one is a warm-up question. How familiar are you with the FuelEU Maritime regulation? So that is the first question that we would like to you to answer, and just to get an understanding that where we are with today's participants. All right. Okay, do we get some answers here? Maybe I need to answer also by myself.
Not familiar.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, now I start to see some replies. Very good. Okay, so it seems that we have about a little bit less than 30% are saying they are very familiar, about 2/3 somewhat familiar, and about 15% are saying that not familiar at all. And for this last group, we prepared couple slides just to explain shortly what is this regulation all about. So we can start with the very short introduction for the regulation before we move into the more detailed questions and discussions. I'll shoot a couple slides from here. All right. So FuelEU Maritime Regulation. So this is a part of the so-called Fit for 55 regulation package from European Union, and together with, for example, shipping being included into EU ETS system, so emission trading system. There were also some other regulations that were supposed to be part of this, but let's focus now on FuelEU Maritime. And what is being regulated in this regulation is the carbon intensity of the energy used on board. So basically, it means that considering that you could comply with this regulation by using some energy saving devices will not work out, because it's specifically looking at the carbon intensity of basically the fuel used on board. And how this works is that we have the baseline set based on 2020 figures, when we had on average 91.16 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per megajoule on the energy used on board the vessels, and then we start to calculate that, okay, 2025 we need to reduce 2% from that figure. So then we end up to somewhere around 89.3. Then 2036%, 2035 14.5, and then until every 5 years we have a stricter target, and until 2050 when we have the last one that is then 80% reduction target, meaning that then it's very, very close to zero emissions already, and can be reached only with really low carbon fuels. And some other interesting aspects about this regulation is that, okay, unlike the other shipping emission regulations, here we consider the so-called life cycle emissions. So meaning that we have to calculate to this carbon intensity also the production and the distribution of the fuel. So for example, in this emission trading system, you calculate only the shipboard emissions, but this is different in that sense. And also we do not consider only carbon dioxide, but also methane and laughing gas and H2O. And which ships are regulated? So ships that are calling European ports, first of all, and ships bigger than 5,000 GT. And in a way that voyages between the regulated European ports, we calculate 100% of the energy in this calculation, where we end up to have this carbon intensity, and then 50% of the energy when the other end of the voyage is outside of Europe and then coming to Europe, and then vice versa. If we have voyage starting from Europe to a third country, then we calculate also 50%. And it will be about 12,000-13,000 vessels that every year will be liable for this regulation. Of course, many of the ships operating only in Europe, but it will touch also global shipping companies that have occasional calls to European ports in the same way as EU ETS is. So if you have traffic to Europe, it's difficult to avoid it completely. Some other aspects. So who is responsible? The regulation is saying that it's shipping company. So basically, the dock holder of the vessel is ultimately responsible for this compliance. And there, I would like to highlight that it is different definition than in EU ETS. In EU ETS, it says ship owner, who can delegate this responsibility for the dock holder, but this is saying shipping company, so it's a different definition. And the last understanding we have got, at least, is that they will not harmonize this definition. But there is a similar cost transfer clause in this regulation as we have with the EU ETS. So it means that whoever is ultimately responsible for this compliance, they have, in a way, legal right to push the cost forward. So basically meaning the operator of the vessel, charterer of the vessel, which makes this very, very interesting, for example, in the case of long-term time-chartered vessels. So let's discuss a little bit more about that later on today. And last but not least, there is a hefty penalty for being non-compliant. So not going into too much into details, but it's so big penalty that at least all of our simulations are showing that being compliant with a way or another is cheaper than paying these penalties. One more point from here. Samir mentioned the e-fuels, and those have a special treatment in this regulation. So there is so-called RFNBO multiplier in the calculation methodology introduced with this regulation. So RFNBO is coming from the words renewable fuel, non-biological origin. So basically e-fuels made out of renewable electricity, and if there is a carbon in that fuel, that carbon must be coming from captured carbon, and it can't be any given captured carbon. It needs to be coming from a biogenic source. So those are in that way promoted in this regulation, and the idea is that if to get the use of these e-fuels up, and if that will not happen, there is a kind of a clause that will then put additional RFNBO fuel quota later on to these regulations. You have to follow if it doesn't happen organically with this. This is reward factor. And I'll stop talking in 2 minutes. I'll describe a couple more things before we move on. So first of all, this carbon intensity in the middle picture here, it's an illustrative picture. Don't take it as any scientific information, but just to represent the idea that we will not have default emission factors for all the fuels like we have had, for example, in EU MRV, IMO, DCS. But each and every fuel, especially these low carbon fuels, we need to calculate separately what is the carbon intensity. So basically, if you buy B30 fuel from different suppliers, those might have a different carbon intensity based on the feedstock used for producing that, and also how much emissions are calculated for the distribution. So it will, of course, make this a little bit complex, and have to be at least aware of this, and how this will ultimately then be taken into account in practical life is that when you are then bunkering these low carbon fuels, you need to get proof for the fuel. So it's called document called proof of sustainability, which then includes all the relevant information that this fuel is certified according EU accepted certification scheme, and the calculation for this carbon intensity. So basically that ultimately then tells you that how much you can reduce the carbon intensity with that one. So it will be a new thing to be received with the fuel, in addition to the bunker delivery note in the future, and it's really valuable document you need to handle with care and good attention. And final thing before I finally shut down and let the panel also talk, so are these flexibility measures. So we have the basic concept of the regulation is that each and every vessel need to comply with this 2% reduction target, but there are these special measures. One of them being borrowing, meaning that okay, if I don't comply with my vessel this year, I can borrow some compliance from the next year and be compliant through that, but then next year I need to pay back with an interest. And then banking means that okay, if I had really good year, I gained some over compliance, I can bank it, so mean it that I can save it for the next year and use it then. And then final measure here is called pooling. So there you basically define group of vessels that are being considered in the calculation as one unit. So basically then we calculate the carbon intensity over a group of vessels, and this provides quite interesting scenarios how to, for example, leverage the use of these dual fuel vessels capable of consuming ultra low fuels like bio-LNG, e-methanol, stuff like that, and then the rest of the fleet could be using traditional affordable fossil fuels, and this one super vessel could keep very many vessels compliant, at least in the beginning of the regulation during the first years. All right, now I give the floor back to our panelists, and let's make a first round of questions. That anything on what I just said you would like to highlight? Is there anything that that should be added here, or that I explained wrong, or should be addressed? Would you like to start, James?
Yeah, I think one other point to mention, Risto, is that FuelEU Maritime also includes a shore power requirement for container and passenger vessels from 2030 that spend more than 2 hours in a port. So in the short term, this regulation is all about the fuel choice, but longer term for certain vessels, there needs to be some consideration for shore power as well.
Really, really good point. What about you, Sam? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of important points to highlight. One is FuelEU Maritime has gone a lot further compared to what EU MRV, etc. were doing. So it's important to point out that FuelEU Maritime has two important concepts. One is it's not just limited to carbon intensity, it is greenhouse gas intensity. So it's important for everyone to realize that it's not just the carbon emissions of a vessel, it includes carbon dioxide, methane slip, as well as nitrous oxides. Why is this important? Is because under EU Maritime, under the EU MRV, it was quite easy for a vessel consuming LNG to assume a nearly 20%, maybe 25%, depending on who you want to talk to. Different experts have a different method of calculation, but it was quite obvious that you could achieve at least a 20% reduction in carbon emissions using LNG. However, under FuelEU Maritime, methane slippage is one of the most important parts to consider, which actually reduces the attractiveness of LNG as a marine fuel, especially depending on the type of engine that the vessel operates, whether it's a 4-stroke or a 2-stroke, and even under 2 strokes, it's whether it's low pressure, high pressure engines. So it does change the attractiveness of LNG as a fuel quite significantly. The other point that is quite important to highlight is, whilst you mentioned there is the option to borrow or bank, there is an interest applicable, as you mentioned, on borrowing, but there is unfortunately no interest on banking. So unlike the financial, or banking in terms of FuelEU Maritime follows the European banking system, which has no interest for money lying in the bank. And so therefore any emissions saved don't actually improve your compliance over the years in terms of interest. You end up only being able to use it as it was in terms of saving. So these are a couple of very important points for everyone to bear in mind. It's greenhouse gas emissions. It is reduction in terms of, as you mentioned, used on board. So unlike for EU ETS, things like improving fuel efficiency or taking other methods like slow steaming to reduce the amount of fuel used, it doesn't actually help in terms of FuelEU Maritime, because you do have to reduce the GHG emissions of the fuel used on a year-by-year basis.
And I really want to point out a major difference for other regulation. I was studying kind of a pure competition for many sectors, like let's say aviation and car, automaking and trucking, railway. So basically, when I asked to many, previous client, when I was working in S&P Global, and then they all say, oh, we can use biofuel to comply, right? But here is a very big gap. We are not really, FuelEU is not really promoting biofuel, because which can use and also competing for another sector, and then price may spiking up and maybe also reducing food availability, right? So basically, so all those factor, because we are talking about not tank to, right, just to wake to wear, a tank to wake, it's actually where to wake. That means you are sourcing everything. And then now it's somehow interesting is that ammonia used to be, say, zero carbon. It's not anymore zero carbon based on FuelEU, because it's derived from fossil fuel, right? Most of case. Obviously, there are green ammonia and green hydrogen, and also green ethanol, whatever. But whatever you're using as is actually derived from fossil fuel. So means massive, penalty on that. So that's why it's a very complicated methodology, but it is indeed reflecting actual carbon emission. So I found out also 2,400 euro is massive. And then many people complain about EU ETS. Nobody will comply with using renewable fuel because it's too cheap, just paying it, right? So that's why somehow 2,400 euro is almost 24 times, right, for current carbon EU ETS penalty. So it means it's also improved the measure. And then I believe it's going to next 5 years. For next year, maybe people does not understand the impact. But next 5 years, it will be massive impact. It's not just about EU ETS. It's actually very important measure. You need to take care of it.
Thank you for your comments, and we will soon take the first question from the audience. But just before going there, I would like to raise a question to the panel that, okay, we have now the situation that when I talk with a lot of bunker suppliers and ask how much is the business for biofuels or low carbon fuels picking up, and the answer I get today is that it's nearly non-existing. So it's nothing is happening in that front. There are some companies that have some trials and then maybe trying to do a little bit voluntary reduction, but otherwise than that, they said that the market is dead. So what do you think? Will it really start for shipping next year? Will this make this change that was at least the idea of the regulation, that ships will start to really go for low carbon alternatives? Would you like to start answering, Daejin?
So this is a very important. For now, you say right, zero interest in the market at this point. And then when I asking our company who need to comply with the CBAM and then also comply with ETS, they are not really know about FuelEU, and then they thinking about it as a kind of another SECA. You know what I mean, right? Basically, people can use 0.5% fuel oil internationally, but you need to pay a lot into the SECA area in Europe. Then you need to pay another fuel. So basically, what we understand is there will be another fuel with the certification that this fuel will be used for FuelEU for this year. Right, that is basically our current understanding, and then some ship owners pay that fuel to comply with it in the charter party. Maybe that will cost us more freight, but otherwise they may not be need to using it because they have a methanol fuel maybe in their fleet pool. They use just normal fuel. That means we can save a fuel, means freight cost, but still you need to pay, let's say, eco ship premium, something like that. You are using less expensive fuel, then you can have a higher freight. So something like understanding of commercial way, not really thinking about, because we are not ship owners or maybe we are not a shipping company, but as a charter perspective, it's more thinking about like SECA area. We need to pay more period or rate in the future, especially next year.
Very good point. Samir, your my understanding, you will be on the supply side. So how do you see? I think in your introduction, you at least indicated that you expect some business around this next year.
So I think, Risto, I didn't mention it as part of my introduction, but I've spent 20 years sailing out at sea. First 20 years, that's my first career, and then moved ashore into marine fuel supplies. So I've seen regulations change from 4.5% sulfur in HFO to 3.5%. I've seen the implementation of the Northwest SECA area. I've seen the implementation of the IMO 2020 VLSFO. And I must admit, before every one of these implementations, the common understanding in the shipping industry is that we would not be able to comply, the fuel would not be available, and that the administrators would be forced to delay the implementation. In every one of these circumstances, the fuel was available, there was no delay, and compliance was at a nearly 100%. Most of the non-compliance was not because of willful negligence, but because of blending mistakes or other factors that were not blamed on negligence. So, FuelEU Maritime is here to stay. It has already been ratified. There is, barring a miracle, there is no chance that it doesn't get implemented. So I think the most important thing for all buyers of fuel to do would be to start planning their compliance strategy based on their preference. There is no single way forward in terms of compliance. There are multiple routes, but the end goal is very clear: to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So I can give a couple of different examples. If we have vessels, tankers, bulk carriers, containers, that are currently 10 years old, they have a lifespan of another 10, maximum 15 years, which takes them into either 2035 or 2040, depending on how long the vessel needs to sail. In the short term, there is a very good method of compliance using biofuels. These are all obviously second-gen compliant with the RFID 2, UCOME in general. A simple example of using a B24 currently allows a ship owner to save or bank the extra 18 or 20% from 2025 to 29, and then thereafter the next 12%, etc., which would allow the vessel to easily comply using biofuels on its own until the end of life. That is on a vessel-by-vessel basis. But of course, it's quite clear that if all vessels were to comply using biofuels, then it's likely that there wouldn't be enough, particularly since biofuels are also competing for attention in the aviation and the road industry. So what can an owner do? There are other methods of compliance on the medium term using e-fuels. That includes LNG with bio-LNG or otherwise e-methanol. And then you use the facility that's allowed to pool vessels, where you use existing vessels in a pool, but ordering new vessels that run on e-fuels, which would allow a fleet of vessels to be compliant for a certain period of time. But I think the most important thing for all customers to realize is that the end goal has already been decided. There isn't a choice in terms of compliance. In time, whether one chooses to go with biofuels or e-fuels, a long-term procurement, a long-term shift in terms of the type of vessels to be used has already needs to be planned out.
Very good, really insightful comments, Samir. James, you see this happening as well, right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons why there's a lack of demand for biofuels at the moment. I think one is that this regulation's caught a lot of the shipping industry by surprise, to be honest. Everyone has been so busy making sure that they comply with EU ETS in the last 12 to 18 months, getting all their paperwork in order for that when this was published, there wasn't a huge amount of awareness around it. And I think the other aspect is as Samir said, the value that you can get from pooling with LNG and LNG dual fuel vessels in operation. Quite a few owners having at least one vessel like that in their fleet. That can be enough to offset your emissions in this regulation for quite a while without needing to move to biofuels. And equally, more owners are probably looking to LNG, methanol and ammonia as their next choice for new building. So if an owner knows that they are going to have an LNG new build, dual fuel new build coming in a couple of years' time, then it may be better to borrow the benefit from that decision to order a new vessel than it perhaps is to order biofuels today. The final challenge is also on where will vessels actually bunker these biofuels. Whilst this is an EU regulation, you incur penalties on your emissions as you sail into the European Union from another location around the world. So the vessel needs to be thinking about getting these lower carbon fuels well before they've even arrived in the European Union. And so that makes it a bit harder, I guess, for the fuel suppliers to know where to make these fuels available. It'll all come down to the different trading routes and trading patterns that the vessels are on to make sure that the fuel is available before the vessel even arrives in the European Union.
Very good.
I think Rusty, there's just one point to highlight from something that James mentioned is fuel buyers need to be quite cautious with using LNG as a method of compliance, because it depends entirely on the type of engine. So if you take, for example, smaller vessels that would naturally have a preference for four-stroke Otto cycle engines, these will not be compliant from 2025 onwards almost immediately because of methane slippage. So it's quite important to be aware of the different type of LNG engines and the well-to-wake GHG emission that has been declared as part of FuelEU Maritime. It's not something that is up for discussion. It is something that has already been declared. So there are differing parameters for LNG in terms of compliance. It's just important to point that out.
Yeah, very good. Very good point. And yeah, maybe we can revert to that LNG discussion later on. We would like to involve a little bit our audience at this point. And while we have been talking already about some fuel choices, so maybe we could actually take one poll here and one more poll, and we have this nice question here. Which alternative fuel do you think will become most predominant in maritime shipping by 2030? And hopefully we can launch this poll now, and yeah, so the options we have had here were LNG, biofuels, hydrogen, ammonia, electricity, methanol, and let's see how the audience are thinking about these. I'm thinking out loud if there is some options missing from here. Well, we don't have nuclear here, but maybe not 230. Sails, wind is the free fuel, like the lobby group of sail makers are saying, but maybe not as the only source of energy. Is there something missing? Can the panelists point out if we have or missing some relevant options? I don't think so. Maybe, of course, it would be nice if we would have also bio-LNG and e-LNG here, but okay. Let's see how it goes.
I think it's important to point out this is up to 2030, so there isn't that much of time. I think we're already in 2024, so I think it's a little bit premature for nuclear and other type of vessels.
Even hydrogen. It's too early.
All right. Okay, let's see what kind of answers we get. We should get it updated. Okay, 131 responses, quite nice number. Okay, so we have our winner here is biofuels with 38%, LNG 26%. What is next one? Then we have methanol about 20%, ammonia 12%, and hydrogen with 4%, and electricity 1%. So quite interesting readings. Would one of the panelists want to comment these replies? Is this aligned with your own thoughts?
So one thing important to just share the view is, in previous company I have tracking the alternative biofuel expectation over last 7 years, and then basically in early stage like 2018, everybody talk about LNG at that point, and then somehow after around 2020, everybody talk about hydrogen and ammonia, and then over last 2 years now everybody talk about e-methanol, e-ethanol. And then we don't know next year, right? What we talk about. Basically, every year it keeps changing. I know you're also tracking it, right? And at this point, it does not talk about it now. CCUS, right? The carbon capture unit, because if you can use it, and then for now, if you can use existing engine, you can use biofuel. So basically, that's all, right? And then maybe you can put the CCUS somehow for the new building, because if you want to using existing engine. So basically, whatever alternative fuel using alternative engine, which will keep you increasing massive capex, right, is something premature. What we call, because what I mean is the hydrogen. 7 years ago, people are expecting 2030 hydrogen will be economically viable. They said, but now how what they expect now? 2035 minimum and 2040. economically viable, basically. So that's why somehow it all doable, but we don't know whether it is doable in terms of economic point of view. At this point, no existing vessel will change the fuel. No existing vessel will change the engine. But we have indeed seen some vessels changing the engine. That's why it's news, right? because it's not happening, so that's why it becomes news, right? So that's why my point is that it could change a lot, but at this point, biofuel is only option. You can use existing vessel, how can I say, engine. But other than that, you need to invest in it. So it's very difficult in terms of capex point of view by 2030. But it's different story 2040. I think that's the point Samir mentioned. Are you speaking, Risto?
Sorry. Yeah. So this really interesting view, and I of course would like to continue a little bit from that. So when we are talking about biofuels, there is also we have heard doubts that there is enough availability.
Supply.
Yeah, supply when we for example in Europe we have very strict criteria as what kind of biofuels can be accepted, and secondly then for example the airline traffic will start to have their own mandates starting, to my understanding, also next year. So it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts about the availability of the biofuels, and second point, okay, CCS, it's we say that okay, hydrogen is not mature, but is carbon capture, in your opinion, mature solution? It would be interesting to hear. There is also a very spread opinions about that. Some are saying that it's just increasing the energy consumption. There is not enough space on board the vessel, and it's impossible to organize the captured carbon collection effectively. And then on the other hand, some are saying that we shouldn't do anything with these other options because carbon capture is coming and solving all the problems. Okay, maybe it was a little bit exaggeration about but it would be really interesting to hear your views about these topics that are, I think these are questions that we hear often, and comments about these topics. So any thoughts?
Yeah,
James?
maybe I can jump in here, Risto. I think in terms of technology availability for carbon capture, it is coming. There's been a few pilots published in the last sort of 18 months of different vessels trying, particularly onboard carbon capture. There was a pilot that Stena did recently on one of their vessels with a onboard carbon capture and storage system. But to highlight the big challenge with the FuelEU Maritime regulation is that carbon capture is not included within the regulation. The regulation is looking at the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel that you bunker, not the emissions that are actually coming out of the funnel of the vessel. So the way FuelEU Maritime is written today, even if you have a carbon capture and storage system installed, you won't get any benefit for that if the vessel has bunkered and consumed, for example, heavy fuel oil. Then you would have quite a large penalty bill that would be due for that. The European Union have said that they will continue to look at carbon capture technology, and I believe they're keeping their eye on it. But yeah, today it's not included within the FuelEU Maritime regulation.
Good points. Well, would you like to, Samir, comment about the biofuel availability considerations?
Yeah, I thank James for raising that point. That is a very, very important point, and it goes back to reminding all the viewers that FuelEU Maritime is about GHG emissions, not just carbon emissions. So whilst carbon capture will benefit an owner from a EU ETS point of view, in terms of reduced ETS costs or emission allowances, but that will not do anything for FuelEU Maritime. So it's very important to have that difference in mind. As far as biofuels is concerned, I think, yes, indeed, the amount of bio feedstock available in Europe is relatively limited, but there is a lot more feedstock capability in Asia, and there has already been a huge shift in terms of how we look at bio feedstocks moving from Asia into Europe in order to fulfill the requirements of FuelEU Maritime and tougher EU legislation. It is absolutely right to say that biofuels are in its current form and based on current feedstock availability is not enough to fulfill the 2050 ambitions. But the important point here is to look at a step-by-step approach. Unless an owner has access to unlimited funds, then there is a certain amount of wiseness in taking a simple and straightforward step-by-step approach in terms of achieving meaningful decarbonization in the short term, banking the excess that is available as of now for use at a later stage. Let's look at some figures. So the current order book for new ships is about 33 million metric tons in terms of fuel consumption. I refer to fuel consumption because there's no point talking about number of ships, as the consumption is quite important in terms of the number of ships. So if we were to assume that the current new order book is somewhere in the region of 33 million metric tons, 50% of that consumption is still on fossil fuel. And that does not include fossil LNG, that is just pure fossil fuel. Residual marine fuel that we used previously. That means 50% of these vessels that are on the current order book that are going to come out onto the water in 2025, 2026, and 2027 will require some form of abatement in order to fulfill FuelEU Maritime requirements. The only answer for those vessels would end up being biofuels. Otherwise, it would require some very, very expensive conversion or retrofitting of the engine in order to comply with it. So we have been discussing about the availability of second-gen biofuels, but the requirements of things like FuelEU Maritime will allow, as well as the penalties, will allow for the development of third-generation biofuels that could come about from algae. So, there is a lot of scope in the development of biofuels from now until maybe 2040, when e-fuels will be more widely available for compliance. That allows biofuels a very interesting pathway into decarbonization. We must also realize that the way FuelEU Maritime is set up, to some experts, they've been very lenient in their ambition for decarbonization. Let's remember that from 2025 to 2029, the requirement is for 2%. From 2030 onwards, it is 6%. 2035 is 14.5%, which means if we were to consider being carbon neutral by 2050 and expect that up to 2034, you only need a reduction of, let's say, 15%. That means the remaining 85% of carbon neutrality or GHG neutrality has to come from 2035 to 2050. If you thought we were having a big problem as of now, I wouldn't like to be part of the discussions to see how big the problem is in 2035 in that case. So it's important to keep that in mind. So it's really important for us to start taking a step-by-step approach into compliance and allowing the development to take place for the next generation of ships.
Very good. Okay. I promised to take at least one question from the audience, and I see that here is a nice voting system. So let's take the most voted one for here. So the question from Christian Plum: who will verify the GHG intensity of a specific fuel and how this will be documented? So is there one of the panelists that would like to take on this? Do you? for example, Samir or James?
I believe the GHG intensity of all fuels has been published as part of the FuelEU Maritime requirement. It is mentioned in one of the articles. I'll get you the article number in a short while.
Yeah, there's a couple of points to add on that, Samir. So for a ship owner, a ship operator, you have two choices. You can either just use the average greenhouse gas intensity values that are published within the standard, or you can choose to have your fuel tested, laboratory tested, measure the greenhouse gas intensity of the actual fuel used, and then submit that instead. There could be a benefit for that if your fuel has a slightly better greenhouse gas intensity than the average, then that would be one way to reduce your penalties slightly. Either way, from 2025, whatever fuel is bunkered, you have to collect the bunker delivery note and a emission certificate for that fuel that will be provided by the fuel supplier, and then submit that to what's called your FuelEU Maritime verifier, which is most commonly a classification society like Lloyd's Register or DNV or the American Bureau of Shipping. All of the classification societies are getting involved as the verifier for FuelEU Maritime. But yeah, there's quite a lot of paperwork to submit for each European Union voyage.
Yeah, and maybe to highlight that for these low carbon fuels, like we mentioned in the beginning, so those might even they have same name, might have a different carbon intensity. So based on the feedstock used and the production and distribution emissions, so it might vary. So that needs to be taken into account. All right.
So I think I just want to add in one important point, because it's a wake to not just the tank to well or whatever. You need to consider how it generated the fuel. So again, I mentioned that ammonia is zero fuel, actually zero carbon fuel, but in terms of the FuelEU perspective, it's very high. How can I say carbon intensive, GHG intensive fuel because it's come from gas normally, right? So basically, maybe twice higher or 3 times higher than just the normal LSFO. So it's totally different perspective. That means how you know is ammonia is generated from what? You need a verifier. So also lies the verifier. So whenever you want to do something, right, you always need not just the pure, always verifier documentation, and which is something difficult now because you need to track the old supply chain and product chain. So somehow I think that is why I think FuelEU will giving us more headache. But anyway, somehow there will be some verifier coming in, and authorized verifier will do that for us.
Yeah. So my understanding is that there is a certification scheme that has been set up for this purpose that will be this ISCC EU, and that kind of provides the instructions how to calculate this, and then this I think I mentioned in the beginning this proof of sustainability, and where you then have this certified calculations in place, and that will be the kind of a final proof for the value of the fuel in this regard. All right. Maybe we would. It would be nice to discuss also a little bit about the commercial setup and the distribution of the liabilities and costs here. And we have here James, who is presenting large ship manager, and Daejin, that is a charter. So how do you see this commercial sharing of the costs? So what is, for example, in your opinion, the role of the charters here, and is it just to pay the bills, or do you see that the charter can take more active role, for example, in the case of having long-term time chartered vessels in the fleet?
Yeah, so the way FuelEU Maritime is set up today, it's what's called the vessel's document of compliance holder, DOC holder, who is responsible for paying the penalties. And in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, that's typically the ship manager. But the ship manager of a vessel is not usually the one selecting the fuel for the vessel. That's more often than not the charterer that's selecting the fuel. And equally, the decision that comes around which technology to have on board the vessel, that's normally the ship owner that makes that decision. So there needs to be a lot of collaboration between all of the parties involved in a vessel. You need the charterer to make a decision on which fuel to supply. You need the ship owner to make whatever modifications are needed to the vessel to be able to use that fuel. And then you need the ship manager, like V.Group, to gather all the data and make the reporting that's necessary to the European Union. And that's quite different, as we sort of mentioned previously, to the way EU ETS is set up. I think with most regulation, historically, there's always been this principle that the polluter pays. The person that is the company that is chartering the vessel to move a product from A to B is the one that is typically seen in the eyes of a lot of regulation as the polluter. So I think the industry will move to sort of commercial arrangements where the charterer is the one that is ultimately covering the penalties. But yeah, there still needs to be a lot of collaboration between that whole supply chain and how that works. And that's going to sort of evolve between now and the end of the year as people start to prepare for FuelEU Maritime.
Very good.
So whenever I join, let's say, certain event between ship owners and the charterers, there are always talk about collaboration. I totally agree. And that there are some initiative as well, right? Many big greenhouse, grain company or maybe iron or miners, they're investing in a certain type. But you see that the total number of vessel per container going for, let's say, alternative fuel, let's say 30, 40%, even 50% for order book. How about dry bulk and then tanker carriers? So small, right? It's almost minimal. You can count it actually, the name of the vessel. So what I mean is that it's a very minimal commercial, how can I say, incentive for many diversified tanker charterers or dry bulk charterers. There are so many. But for per container, you have let's say Nike or maybe some Amazon, maybe have a massive goal to incentive themselves to make a promoting their brand with using less carbon or whatever. But for all the other company, it's all about money, commercial decision, right? So that means FuelEU is making more incentive to making more cleaner fuel rather than just the saving fuel, and then incentivizing by heavy, how can I say, we call penalty, so that you need to develop any somehow. But at this point, why biofuel is coming up? Because 2% you can comply with biofuel for next 5 years. So for us, for charterers perspective, you just pay SECA or not SECA at this point. But 6% biofuel, or maybe 10%, 20, Sami just mentioned, 50%, you cannot do that anyway. You should comply something else. Then somehow it's a practically point of view, you need to build the ship now to comply that one. But at this point, only container sector is moving that way. But dry tanker, only dry bulk we are seeing is that many the big ship owners who have a massive fleet, they can do 1 or 2 e-methanol, they can comply in FuelEU at this point, right? Basically. So that's why for now, at this point, when you look into commercial point of view, there is not really urgent for charterers point of view. only who need promoting their brand and then dealing with consumers, maybe they need to do that. And then also for us as well, we need to look into our counterparty, like a grain house. They want to do that one, we may think about it, basically. So that's why it's more or less a holistic view rather than one charterers, let's say, let's do that. It's not, does not happen. You always need commercial incentive. So at this point, even I said, let's say 2,400 euro will be very attractive to move forward. But next 5 years, just 2% does not really, necessarily attractive to move forward, because you can use biofuel regardless of whatever reason, right? So there is not really promoting a greener fuel. That's why there are one regulation, right? Incentive, if you are not using non-biological, how can I say, source, you have incentivizing, because everybody know next 5 years will be more or less about biofuel blending fuel. That's what I believe at this point, because engine can only comply with biofuel at this point. So I think, as James, you mentioned that maybe people are preparing this regulation in Singapore or some other area. I don't believe so. They will just call on Rotterdam Port or Gibraltar and then just consume just small parcel. Or maybe you're using the more vessel who have a large fleet, who have a 1 or 2 e-methanol, then you can use it without any problem for FuelEU. So at this point, 2% means not really have an attractive to move forward, cleaner fuel, rather than just paying more fuel price for blended biofuel. So at this point, that's what I point of as a commercial point of view. But yes, there will be holistic collaboration needed, but we need to be practical as well.
Very good. Okay, well, let's take one more poll here before continuing the discussions about these interesting aspects. Let's pick here. Okay, here is one interesting poll question. So let's ask this one. So how prepared do you feel your organization is for the upcoming FuelEU Maritime requirements? And here we have options for saying very prepared, B, somewhat prepared, or C, not prepared at all. James, what is your feeling about this? Are you fully prepared or somewhere in between?
So at V.Group, we're doing a lot of work to prepare for FuelEU Maritime regulation, and there's definitely still a lot more work to do. We're fully on top of what is involved in the regulation. We're working with all our ship owners that have vessels trading in the EU to start to raise awareness of this regulation, and looking at different software solutions that can help them track it. But as we say, there's still a lot of collaboration still to do throughout the year. And until those charter party and ship management agreements are agreed, we have plans in place on which fuels to use and how to pool vessels. There's still work to do, but yeah, definitely well on the way to getting there.
Very good. Okay, if we read the responses here, so then we have majority saying that somewhat prepared. So, but basically meaning that there is still some work to do. 25% not prepared at all, and about 15% very prepared. Samir, do you have any comment on this? What is your feeling when you're discussing with your customers that how aware they are, first of all, and if they are aware, how prepared they are?
So I'd like to answer the question slightly differently. Let's look at what we're doing. What we're doing with FEPSA as well. Currently, we've got one of the largest plants in Southern Europe already up and running, producing about 600,000 tons of biofuels. Of course, majority of the feedstock is first gen as of now, because this plant was set up to answer the mandate for the requirement of biofuels for the road industry in Spain. But nevertheless, the plant does have the capability of co-processing second-gen biofuels, second-gen feedstocks as well. We have already put in motion construction of a second plant at the La Rabida Energy Park in Huelva that will finally have a capacity of another 500,000 tons of biofuel, which should be ready by about 2026. That would give us the capability of about 1 million tons of biofuel. That would be divided, of course, between road, aviation, and the maritime industry. CEPSA have announced the creation of the largest green hydrogen valley project in the south of Spain, which will have about 2 gigawatts of 2 gigawatts of hydrogen production, renewable energy for hydrogen production. Part of that project will be a plant for 600,000 tons of either e-ammonia or e-methanol, depending on preference. It's not been decided as of now. So we are making strides in line with our strategy of positive motion to make fuels available for customers, especially for sectors that are hard to decarbonize, like aviation and the maritime industry. On a personal note, I am very bullish on the availability of biofuels for us in the Straits to start with, and then as we go along, really make available the e-fuels that would be required for the industry as we go forward. It's true when we look at it, there are quite a few customers who are not prepared and would have preferred to take a wait and watch attitude, which is fine. We stand ready to support them when the need comes about. But there are also a lot of customers who have already started their journey on decarbonization. I think CEPSA has already done something in the region of 10,000 tons of B24 last year. In fact, ports like Singapore have done about 250,000 tons of B24 during 2023, and there are some very large shipping companies that have been using biofuel for quite some time in Rotterdam. So I think there are many customers who are well prepared and are taking steps in order to achieve decarbonization, either for regulatory requirements or purely for sustainable, for the purpose of achieving their own sustainability targets. From my point of view, that's the way we look at it. I mean, I think there are customers who are well prepared and are already taking steps to go forward. And for those not prepared, I think 23% as of now, I think it is very, very important to start planning a strategy because a wait and watch approach could have quite dire circumstances if nothing has been planned, because the availability of choices is definitely limited. And so the faster one plans a strategy, the better one will be prepared to avoid penalties going forward.
I think you're muted again, Risto.
Sorry. So let's take again a couple questions from the audience here. Maybe these are quite big, short ones. So first one here was from Katerina Hjort asking, when will FuelEU apply to vessels below 5,000 GT? So do we have any knowledge in the panel about this one? Is there? I think I recall that it was. Now we are talking about including those vessels to EU MRV.
So I think we can take some solace from the past. EU MRV started in 2018, and FuelEU Maritime is commencing in 2025. If I'm not mistaken, EU MRV will include vessels under 5,000 GT in 2027. So you could start, predicting forward that by 2030, it's highly likely that vessels under 5,000 GT would also start having to apply to EU. But that is just a supposition. There is no clear mandate as of now.
Yeah. If somebody from the audience remembers that, I recall that there has been a discussion, but just type into the questions so we can take it up here. But my recollection is that the limit would then be 400 GT. So then it would, of course, include quite many many more vessels than what we have at the moment, and barges and going quite down on that limit. Another question here from Jeff: can proof of sustainability be used to offset? I understand this question so that for both EUA and FuelEU, does it count as double counting?
So I think it's probably worth saying, Risto, that in the eyes of the EU, EU ETS and FuelEU Maritime are considered two completely separate pieces of regulation. With EU ETS, it's the ship owner that's responsible for reporting. For FuelEU Maritime, it's the DOC holder. Whilst using different fuels will help you to offset your penalties in both regulations. The two aren't linked. They are completely independent in the eyes of the European Union.
Yeah. In a way, I could see the connection in that sense, that if you have some low carbon fuel that applies for this zero emission calculation in EU ETS, then I believe that you can use the same certificate to prove that than this low carbon intensity in FuelEU Maritime. And good. Okay, there was one more. Let's take one more from the audience. So here is a question about the RFNBO fuels, that if you see already some interest in this, then and giving because of this double counting and pooling options. So do we have any insights from the panel that are these new types of RFNBO fuels picking up in?
Yes, I believe Risto, there is a very large shipping company with a light blue hull that I used to work with until recently, that have already gone quite hammer and tong in terms of their ambition to start using e-fuels. I believe the same company, like Juhani, have also advocated for an end to conventionally fueled vessels, as somewhat similar to the rules that are coming about for the automobile industry in Europe, where there is already a mandate in place to stop producing cars with an internal combustion engine by 2030 or 2035, one of the two. So yes, there is already an interest in RFNBOs. I believe the 2x multiplier allows for a very interesting benefit, although it's also important to point out that the 2x multiplier has, up to now, is only valid until 2034. Thereafter, the 2x multiplier does stop. So there is a very short-term advantage to be had. And I think one of the points that we haven't made clear so far as well is that FuelEU Maritime really does try to put the emphasis on e-fuels going forward. It is important to allow the industry some leeway in terms of the preparatory phase to reach that limit. And so therefore, you've got the lower compliance requirements from now until 2035. But the exponential increase in compliance really does indicate a willingness from the EU regulatory side of it to steer the shipping industry towards e-fuels rather than trying to achieve compliance for 2050 using conventional fuels. So yes, given double counting, RFNBOs are becoming quite a lot more attractive to shipping companies.
I think I want to add that this one, when we study kind of pure availability, I think, Samir, you mentioned that you are ready for providing biopure blended fuel, right? Basically. But when you look into another industry as well, they are also pushing a lot to decarbonization, and then they don't have option. They only using biofuel is only option because they cannot use ammonia. They cannot use hydrogen. They cannot use battery. They're only using high carbon intensity fuel, which is biofuel, basically, or nuclear, right? So that's why somehow there will be certain period that biofuel demand will pick up so strongly, so that the commercial is so expensive, then e-fuel become very much attractive, basically, right? So it's difficult to predict, but there is a structural change for sustainable aviation fuel, as well as biofuel in Europe, as well as everything is going for how can I say, decarbonized fuel. At this point, biofuel looks very attractive, but somehow that means demand will pick up, right? And the price may not be viable at some point. So it's a very interesting to see, right? The scrubber choice, LSFO, HFO. LSFO demand is a stay, but HFO demand is dropping significantly, basically. And then somehow the gap is providing the incentive for scrubber. And then everybody wait and see, and skeptical. They even building install scrubber for 15 years old capesize, basically. So it's somehow, and the VSCC as well. So somehow commercial viability is the key. And at this point, when you look into another industry, basically biofuel likelihood getting expensive. So that's something you need to prepare for a certain point, because if you want to comply, especially if you have a heavy exposure to Europe, either you build e-fuel vessel in your pool, or you need to prepare the high biofuel cost.
Maybe that could lead us to a next question for all of the panelists. How do you see the preparation for this regulation? Would it make sense to have more than just one fuel in your portfolio to avoid this risk of, for example, biofuel price exploding? Or how do you see this? Is it easier to make your strategy based on only one fuel, or is that becoming too risky to rely only one that gets really costly by the end of the day?
I think, Risto, this is where the option for pooling comes into the mix. Certainly in the early days, FuelEU Maritime doesn't require every vessel to take biofuels. Sorry, if you have just one vessel that decides to take an e-fuel, maybe even for one voyage, depending on obviously how many vessels you have trading in the EU and how frequently, how long those voyages are, that one vessel doing one or two voyages on an e-fuel or a biofuel could be enough to offset every other vessel that you have in your fleet through pooling. And equally, it doesn't even have to be in your own fleet. You could decide to pool with another ship owner or someone else that has a vessel using e-fuel, and that would be enough to offset your emissions. So certainly in the short term, at least in the next few years, if you can get just one or two voyages on a lower carbon fuel, that's potentially enough for you to meet the requirement of the regulation.
Anyone else? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I would also add, for ship owners, it's quite important to look at the short, medium, and long-term view as well. I think in the short term, we've been quite unanimous in the fact that biofuels are available, and they already form the basis of the first step that you can use to decarbonize. But I think in the long term, in the medium to long term, ship owners would require to spread their bets around. I think we do need to realize that just mentioning the names e-methanol and e-ammonia don't actually mean that they will be produced with the same amount of capacity that we have today. Shipping uses about 300 to 320 million metric tons of conventional fuel as of today. And if we look on an energy density calculation, the amount of e-methanol or e-ammonia is at least double that quantity. So if we needed in 2050 600 million metric tons of e-fuels, then that's about 3 to 4 times the current production of the grey version of these. So it's a Herculean task to be able to achieve. The production of e-fuels also requires a huge investment in terms of renewable energy for electrolysis. It doesn't come for free. So e-methanol requires both electrolysis as well as the availability of biogenic CO2, which is not necessarily available in great numbers. The production of e-ammonia requires renewable energy as renewable energy, and therefore hydrogen as its base. So there are some very big pathways that are required to be cleared in terms of the development of renewable energy in order to have green hydrogen as the backbone for e-fuels, as well as a requirement for biogenic CO2 in terms of methanol. So that would determine that the availability of a single fuel is not necessarily going to be the answer. There would be multiple different choices that need to be taken in order to achieve compliance based on the availability of different options. And I include in that, other ideas as well, whether it's nuclear, whether it is hydrogen-based fuel cells, and I must admit, whether it is something that has not been thought of as of now. Remember that from 2025 to 2050 is 25 years of exponential human growth. The ability for us to come up with weird and wacky solutions to a problem, must not be discounted. And so therefore, 25 years from now, when we do achieve compliance, it could be with a fuel that, we've never really thought of discussing as of now.
Very good. Let's think. We have 10 minutes to go. Maybe one really quick question for Samir that has been on the top of my head for some time. Now you have a big stake on the biofuel business, and what has been a little bit how to say, looks a little bit weird from the outside is now that when we compare the biofuel prices, but what we can see that there is a quite big difference between the prices on Netherlands and the other countries, and it seems to be part of this. The reason being that in Netherlands there is some kind of bio-ticket system that is basically allowing road traffic to reduce their emissions by selling low carbon fuels to shipping. I haven't got my head fully around that, but what do you think about this kind of setup, Samir, that there is one national system that is in a way giving a low possibility to sell marine biofuels with a lower price than with the other countries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I must admit, in a few years ago, we did make use of the HPE ticketing system in order to increase the amount of biofuel that we use. It was something that was suggested in multiple different countries, multiple different jurisdictions. You couldn't fault the Dutch government from actually being proactive. I must admit that perhaps they did not realize when they went ahead with it the kind of confusion it would cause in their own markets, because the cost of the HPE tickets and the cost of biofuel started widening quite significantly, and there were quite a few financial cases where it didn't make sense. However, it was a great incentive, especially for some very large container shipping companies, to launch products like eco delivery or green shipping or whatever for large BCOs like Nike and IKEA to start promoting a low carbon shipping alternative. This alternative has also now spread to bulk carriers, where there is the possibility of shipping green carbon or green coal in order to produce green steel. I think it's equivalent to the FuelEU Maritime allowing a 2x multiplier for e-fuels. There has to be some incentive provided to ship owners to make the choices that will make a difference going forward. I think if these incentives are not available, then shipping would end up using the most cost-effective solution. which is not necessarily the best for a climatic change, for climate change. And so therefore, all of these incentives, whether it is by a singular government or whether it is by a coalition of governments, help shipping to take the right approach. And I think it's the right way to go in order to incentivize the maritime industry to decarbonize as quickly as possible.
Okay, so you're not bitter about the Dutch companies being able to sell with the cheaper price.
I think given where we are located, let's put it this way: it was bittersweet because maybe we lost out at the beginning, but part of the fruits of that labor is now paying off because demand is growing in the Straits as the Dutch HPE system winds down a little bit. I believe as of now it's only at 0.4%. So there's really not much incentive to bunker biofuels in Rotterdam as it would be in Ceres. Okay,
very good. All right. Time for the final poll before we start to wrap up, and let's take this last one. So the question will be about the biggest challenges. So what do you see as the biggest challenge in optimizing bunker procurement under FuelEU Maritime? So first option being compliance with the regulations, B, cost management, C, fuel availability, D, technological reasons, E, environmental impact. So please reply to this. We are close to the end, so grasp some last drops of energy to reply this one, and let's see where it takes us. It's only 2 clicks away to give a reply for this. Very good. Okay, so I see only 34 responses. This is not okay. Now we are getting more. Good. Let's wait until we have 60 and then start to. So please, couple more replies for this one. All right. Okay. So what we have here, the biggest concern here is the fuel availability. So there we have almost half of the replies indicating that as a problem, and then 1/5 of the replies saying cost management and compliance with regulations, and no one seems to be worried about the environmental impact. I don't know what to think about that, but that seems to be the reply, and then some answer promoting the technical upgrades. Any takes on this from the panel? Fuel availability being the biggest concern.
Well, I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg story. I think everyone needs to realize. Again, I go back into historical evidence. When we went, when we switched from HSFO to VLSFO, the biggest worry was fuel availability, and I think that was answered quite quickly by fuel suppliers. As far as we're concerned, even when we look at it from supply in the Straits area, what we would be looking to follow is the order book, really. And as the order book increases in terms of a specific fuel choice from ship owners, the incentive to make the fuel available would be very high. So if it's fuel availability without a necessity to link it to cost management, then I think fuel availability is not a problem. The problem here would be the combination of fuel availability at a price that is sustainable or suitable for shipping as an industry. That's where we constantly are aware of where the limit lies.
Okay, that makes a very good conclusion for this discussion. Do you want to, James, have a short take on the discussions today? Do you have some final words about these topics?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe today.
Yeah, thank you, Risto. I mean, I think we've had a really good debate on fuel availability, biofuels versus e-fuels. That's been a big conversation. I think it has probably, hopefully, helped our audience to understand what FuelEU Maritime is actually all about. We've covered a lot of information on vessel sizes, on what emissions are covered, the fact that it's looking at greenhouse gas intensity and not just carbon emissions. And yeah, the fact that the big deadline coming up is the 1st of January to start complying with this. So not long left, but yeah, hopefully we've helped our audience to provide some useful information on what this regulation brings.
Very good. Daejin, final words from you.
Yes, thanks for the today, and then also really good discussion. Thanks for the panelists as well.
Very good. All right. So, but let's all thank also V.Group for organizing this discussion. They have done a good job, and we had at best almost 200 participants in this discussion, which is a really amazing number. Thanks from my side. It has been really nice to run this panel, really nice panelists, and really, of course, my favorite topic, FuelEU Maritime. So I could have been continuing 2 more hours, but I understand people have some other things to do. So let's conclude it here and hope we see you again in some other event. Thank you very much and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.